If you've been following the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you've probably been confused if you haven't read a lot about it, about who are all these actors taking place. So in this video, I hope to explain basically the primary factions of the Palestinians, of the groups that claim to represent the Palestinians. Also hope to explain, what some of these acronyms or names, the PA or the Palestinian National Authority, or what the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, are, and who Fatah and Hamas are, as well as just a little bit more background to help you navigate this conflict as you're trying to learn more. Let's just start in chronology. Let's just start with the group Fatah. So Fatah is a Palestinian political party / militia initially that emerges in 1959, and it basically is conglomerating in the 1950s around Palestinian diaspora elements. Many of these diaspora individuals, including Yasser Arafat, who becomes the longtime leader of the Palestinian Authority, are people who are caught up in the milieu of Arab nationalism, some of the revolutionary ideologies that are floating around college campuses across the Arab world during this time. A lot of ideas around decolonization, so tinged with Marxism, tinged with Enlightenment thought. So they're kind of this ideological stew of revolutionary resistance fighters who believe in the ultimate goal of liberating Palestine, basically forcing, I don't have a more polite way to put it, but to destroy Israel and to allow Palestinians to return home. That is their primary goal. Many of these are refugees who had been displaced from their home. These are young men. These are men generally in their 20s and 30s. This group primarily gains prominence in 1968 when they have a standoff with Israeli forces at the Battle of Karama in what today is Jordan, that wins them a lot of prestige. And this vaults them into the leadership of something called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. The PLO had been founded a couple of years earlier in 1964 by the Arab League, a group of Arab states that debates Arab issues and tries to push forward an Arab agenda on an international scale. Primarily from my readings of the PLO and its history, initially Arab states hoped this would be a organization that the Arab states could control, especially Egypt, could control for their own benefit, because the Palestinians had a way of, upsetting the balance or the tenuous peace sometimes that existed between Arab states and Israel, none of which had peace treaties at this time. But after the 1967 war, which we'll talk about in another video, and the beginning of the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, there was no denying the importance of the role of Fatah. And Fatah wins the majority of seats in the PLO and becomes the primary driver of this larger umbrella movement that holds many different Palestinian parties. Other parties are mostly secular, not all of them, but you have groups like the PFLP that was established by George Habash. That's the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. That's heavily influenced by Marxist thought, and is run by a Palestinian Christian. You also have the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or DFLP, also that is an active partner in many of the raids. And so when we look at Palestinian terrorism or resistance during the 1960s and 70s and 80s, much of this is being driven by the PLO. And when we're also looking at Israeli efforts to marginalize Palestinians, much of that is targeting the PLO during this time, and specifically Fatah. Yasser Arafat becomes kind of this primary individual that's a thorn in the side of Israel, if you're wanting to view it in that regard. The PLO will reject the right of Israel to exist up until the 1990s, at the beginning of the Oslo Accords, basically 92-93. By 94, they have reached an agreement in principle that allows the PLO, which had been operating in diaspora, to return to territories earmarked for some level of Palestinian autonomy. Palestinians would argue this was always meant to be a state. Israelis are more mixed on that view. I think the international community generally has endorsed the view that this was meant to be a state for the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority returns, or the PLO returns, and takes control of this newly created entity known as the Palestinian Authority, which is a quasi-governmental or semi-governmental organization that is tasked with the administrative functions of government in various areas of the occupied territories, including most of Gaza and the urban centers of the West Bank that are predominantly Palestinian. This would be like Jericho and Bethlehem and Ramallah and Nablus, Hebron as well. So in order to understand what happens next after this creation of the Palestinian Authority that's led with Yasser Arafat as its president, we need to actually go back and just kind of discuss the counter to these movements, and that would be Hamas and, to a lesser extent, some of the other more religious or Islamic factions of Palestinian leadership that come. So prior to 1967, and really prior to the 1980s, the vast majority of groups operating on behalf of the Palestinians had endorsed some kind of secular identity. And of course, a large portion of the Palestinian population was Christian. I shouldn't say large, but significant. About 10% initially were Christian. That has declined over the years, unfortunately. That remains true until what we call the First Intifada. Now, the initial roots of Hamas lay in the Muslim Brotherhood, and is basically an ideological brother of the Muslim Brotherhood, tinged with like this element of Palestinian nationalism. It begins as a social charity, basically known as the Islamic group, that is founded by a number of Palestinian Muslims in Gaza in the 1970s that is generally providing jobs and education and food for Palestinian refugees and Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And it builds support through those means, and it generally shies away from the militancy. But there is one guy that's involved here. His name is Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And Ahmed Yassin, who is involved in the foundation of this Islamic group, has fiery rhetoric. He's a Palestinian refugee himself who had fled to Gaza in 1948. He's a quadriplegic. He can't walk or any of those things. And by the time we get to the First Intifada, he has been prepping for the establishment of a more militaristic approach. And as Fatah is beginning to moderate its position, Hamas is holding that stance of a more rejectionist stance, rejecting the right of Israel to exist and basically demanding the destruction of Israel so that all Palestinians can return, and to a lesser extent, less forceful in this manner, but, to a lesser extent, the establishment of kind of an Islamic republic in Palestine, or some kind of Islamic government based on, kind of Muslim Brotherhood ideology in that regard. Hamas also begins pioneering the use of suicide bombing. While we don't see that in the First Intifada, we really do start to see that in the 1990s as they kind of push back against some of the peace movement, and we see it in full display in the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2005, in which Hamas carries out a series of suicide bombings that terrorize Palestinian or Israeli citizens during that time. Hamas continues this rejectionist stance all the way, till today. And really, to understand, Hamas and Fatah initially were both part of this Palestinian National Authority. Hamas could run for elections, they could have power within this, and this comes to a seminal event. The United States pressed the Palestinians to hold open elections in 2006. Hamas wins a plurality of seats in these elections, does quite well, and especially does really well in Gaza, which basically causes everybody to pump the brakes. Now, it's also important for us to understand that Hamas in these elections actually moderates its positions. It actually even runs a Palestinian Christian on their ticket and implicitly says, like, we might recognize Israel in exchange for, some kind of armistice and, stopping of attacks on Palestinians. Of course, the international community puts a lot of pressure, and Israel as well puts a lot of pressure on how do we handle the Palestinian National Authority now that it has Hamas as a major component and in some respects should be the representative of the Palestinian people, in some people's opinion. And so essentially this leads to what will be a civil war between Hamas and Fatah. And there is this civil war that emerges in 2007 between Fatah and Hamas. Hamas kicks Fatah representatives out. There's, massacres that take place on their sides, and Hamas cements its control over Gaza. And this is also at a time when Israel has withdrawn troops from Gaza and withdrawn Israeli citizens from Gaza, but has still kept a very tight security cordon and still controls the electricity, the water, and enforces a naval blockade on the western seas of Gaza. So it's not exactly like Gaza is free to itself. And there's a series of wars that are fought between Hamas and Israel over the next several years, 2009, 2014 being amongst the most prominent. During that time, of course, we have the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit and the negotiations there. It's important for us to also understand one of the reasons Hamas gained popularity. It's not as much as we might think that people love Hamas and think they are great. There are definitely its actual supporters. But over the years, Fatah had been seen as mostly corrupt and largely inefficient. As Oslo Accords failed to achieve marginal gains for Palestinians, many people saw it as problematic, especially as the heads of Hamas and the heads of of Fatah and the heads of the Palestinian Authority, kind of lived lavish life. There were reports of corruption, of siphoning off funds, and having $3 billion slush funds personal funds that you could draw on as a leader of Fatah or of the Palestinian side. Also important that Israel largely neglects Fatah, because Fatah has rejected armed struggle and generally holds to that line. And therefore, when Hamas carries out its violent attacks, its rocket attacks, of course being bolstered by Iran, it's actually normally to force Israel into some sort of negotiation that normally frees prisoners. And so it creates this dynamic where, in some sense, a lot of Palestinians view Hamas as being able to provide more material gains for Palestinians than Fatah, that has tried a strictly diplomatic approach since the Oslo Accords in order to attain its goals and achieve what is hoped for Palestinians, some kind of just lasting peace in their historical homeland.